video is all about taking action to get change. Now, it's pointless us always complaining and we don't have any proposals. So the first step of this proposal is to help the police federation get their unpaid overtime. Now, I'm actually in contact with the chairman of the federation, Corporal Rowan James, and he actually endorses the making of this video. Now, the government needs to know that the people back the police and that they should get their overtime. So the idea is to start a petition, and if we get the over 15,000 signatures, we must then get a response from the office of the Prime Minister. But this petition is a bit different in that it will contain proposals also about how the public sector workers can get an improved 4% deal. And most critically, it will open the door for an analysis of the IMF agreement, which is at the heart of all the problems that we have in Jamaica, such as the bad roads, lack of education, lack of health care. But I'm going to cover that in a different video. So I'm going to look at the stance of the police first. Now, I have to read a quote from Holness, and this was back in 2015 when he was on the campaign trail. He said, "If you want to fight crime, you have to make the crime fighters feel happy, appreciated and motivated." However, last year, I think you all know, that the police force had to take the government to court for unpaid overtime dating way back to 2008. So you can see such barefaced hypocrisy from the PM. Because if you remember, also on the campaign trail, he also promised everybody cheaper electricity. And we know what kind of electricity prices that we have at the moment. So this action that is taken is immoral and it's actually shameful. I mean, it's actually disgraceful to see the police officers outside the Supreme Court holding placards that they're slaves. It really is embarrassing. Now, the JPF, the Federation, they've actually trying to compromise, and they said, look, pay us from 2015. But Clark isn't having any of it. He says, no, we'll pay you from 2019. And not only that, add insult to injury, he wants to pay them over 6 years and in dribs and drabs. So it's completely wrong. And that's why I'm asking people to sign this petition. Now, as usual, when there's any kind of problem regarding money, you can always know that the IMF is behind it. Now, the government will give a reason for the lack of spending and it's alleged indebtedness of Jamaica, and then they'll tell you about the lack of fiscal space. Well, the truth of the matter is that is not a reason, it's an excuse, because the lack of fiscal space is actually created by the IMF agreement. And the IMF agreement under that, it does two things: using lots of the people's money to store in the reserves. That's money that we could use for investment. And the other thing is to use around about 1/3 of each budget just to service debt. That is, pay interest and pay off some of the debt. Another condition is that the wage bill must be cut to round about 9% of GDP. Now, in my opinion, the whole policy is evil. Now, if we look at the hoarding, which started in 2013, when the IMF arrived on the island and started this agreement, the amount of reserves today is now 3.9 billion. Now, if you look at how much Jamaica earns a year, we've never got over 16 billion. So we have a substantial amount compared to GDP in the reserves, which cannot be justified. Now, as a poor country, you have to ask, how did we manage to save nearly 4 billion? It isn't because the economy is going up. We all know that because it's dependent on tourism. It just stagnates like that. So how they did it was, of course, raising taxes, creating new taxes, and also cutting expenditure everywhere. That's why we have poor roads again and no health care. So all of that, we'll call that, which is austerity. Now, another expense that they've cut is wages. So that's why they haven't paid the police. because not paying the overtime just makes it look like you've artificially kept the wage bill low. So in my opinion, the money in the reserves, part of that money actually comes from not paying the police, and that should be repaid immediately. Now some people say that, oh well, you can't touch the reserves. But look at it this way. Say there's 3.9 billion in there. Now at the end of this financial year, i.e. March 2022, the IMF has set a target that we should have 3.5 billion in the reserves. So we've got about 400 billion in excess. That's what Clark has put there for whatever reason. So there's 400 billion that he can use to repay the police, and he needs to do it right now, and that's why we should sign the petition to tell this man he must pay the police their work, their money. Now, as I said, the only compromise that should be made by anybody is by the police force, because they should be saying, look, we won't actually charge you interest on the money that you've actually properly stolen from us. The other thing that the police have done is reject, quite rightly, the 4% increase. Now, 4% pay rise, 4% of nothing is nothing. Now, again, under the IMF agreement, wages have stagnated from 2013. And again, the only reason for that is to maintain this 9% of GDP. Now, if you're going to say to somebody, we're not going to give you any pay increases, then that will mean your cost of living must also be the same. But that's not the case in Jamaica. Since the IMF have arrived, the Jamaican dollar has depreciated 59%. Now, a loaf of bread back in 2016 cost $150. That same loaf of bread today costs $410. So how can you tell anybody that you're going to pay them only 4% increase? It doesn't work. It's inhumane and it cannot be defended. So the question is this: how can we then increase that 9% of GDP to give public sector workers a higher wage? Well, 14% of GDP is actually used solely to service the debt, i.e. pay interest and reduce the debt. 14%. Now, I'm not an economist, so I then went off and had a look at our debt management. Now, in 2013, we paid 2.27 billion. That was what was allocated, that was what allocated to debt. And last year, it was 2.13 billion. Now, back in 2013, the actual debt was 20 billion. And at the end of last year, financial year, 2021, the debt was 13.5 billion. So that's a reduction of 6.5 billion. Now, I added up, because I'm boring, I went and looked at each budget and saw how much was allocated to debt. And when I added it all up, it came to 17.7 billion. 17.7 billion has been used to reduce debt by what? 6.5 billion? So what we're saying, 11.2 billion has been used just for interest. Obviously, there's a massive problem here. And again, that's why we need to sign this petition so we can get some answers. I don't know if we have extra debt. There's obviously extra debt with the Chinese, but we're completely in the dark about the debt management.
Well, let me hear you say, man.